Thank you, Will. Good to be here and have this series of lectures. Thank you for the invitation. And this one is about what's innate in the brain. It's something that I've been thinking about for quite a long time, and I must just emphasize for the biologists that I am not a biologist, but when I venture into areas like this, I always am careful to find a co-author who is an expert in the area, and in this case, this particular one, I'm working with Mark Solms, who is a world-known neuropsychologist. And the issue is what is innate in the brain is determined by what is innate determined by our evolutionary history, and what is learned determined by culture and our life experiences. And this is therefore the very old nature versus nurture question, one of the very old questions in terms of human makeup and in a sense about what it is to be human. Now, the discussion up to now of the nature versus nurture question by a lot of people has not taken seriously brain structure or brain development. And when they are included, I claim that a clear picture emerges about what is innate and what is not innate. And that's what I'm going to try to present to you. So the claims, a great many innate brain modules have been claimed by linguists and by evolutionary psychologists. Sorry, I'll just wait for... So a great many brain modules have been claimed by linguists and evolutionary psychologists. They suggest that much behavior today has been determined by evolutionary adaptations to what is known as the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, or EEA, which is often stated to be the African savanna because the human race originated in Africa. Now, in fact, a lot of the crucial origination of the human mind took place not in the savanna, but on the coast. But that's, in a sense, a kind of a detail. So the initial claim which sort of really got this thing going was the claim by Noam Chomsky of an innate language module. And Chomsky wrote at length about what he called a language acquisition device, a hypothetical module of the human mind posited to account for children's innate predisposition for language acquisition. And Chomsky claimed that this language acquisition device embodies what's called a universal grammar. And this is a generic grammar of which all grammars that are known are supposed to be subsets, and you're supposed to be able to get any specific grammar like German or English or Italian or whatever by setting switches in this universal grammar. And so the idea was that the reason that children were so easily able to learn language is because they've got this innate module, the universal, with the universal grammar built in, and their interaction with their social environment switched the switches for the particular grammar which they were encountering in their local area. Now, the main argument in the favor of the language acquisition device is the argument from alleged poverty of stimulus, arguing that unless children have significant innate knowledge of grammar, they would be unable to learn language as quickly as they do. They do not have enough examples to use to learn the rules, because the point about language is that there's if you look at it from the Chomsky view, there's a set of rules from which you can produce, in effect, an infinite set of possible sentences. One of the great things, and children can't learn all possible sentences. They have to somehow learn the rules, and the rules are actually quite complicated. And the basic idea there, which underlies this sort of argument for the language acquisition device, is children simply don't have enough experience in the time available, so there's a poverty of stimulus. And this is one of the major arguments. Now, it has been supported by some by a mathematical theorem known as Gold's theorem, which is based on what's called learning theory applied to infinite sentences. And if you're going to learn how, the point is that in principle the sentence can be infinite if you just say just add subclauses within subclauses within subclauses. According to language theory, you can have infinite sentences. And Gold's theorem has been used by some people allegedly as a proof of the existence of these innate language modules. Now, actually, this is a category mistake. You can't argue about biological reality from this kind of mathematical argument, and we could talk about that later on. Since then, evolutionary psychology proponents, Bust, Cosmides, Tooby, Geary, and many others suggested we have many other innate language modules, and amongst them, there's a large literature on this: a visual perception module, a face recognition module, an instinct for detecting facial attractiveness, a theory of mind module, a folk psychology module, a cheetah detection module, a folk physics module, a folk biology module, a number module encoding innate arithmetic. All of these have been claimed to be innately built into our minds. Now you can see that they're beginning to be quite a lot of these alleged modules. For instance, the folk physics module is supposed to already, when you are born, there's some innate ideas about how physics works, and the same for biology. Now, when they make these arguments, there is no biological evidence that such evolutionary determined innate modules actually exist. The evidence that they use is about behavior, and then they produce evolutionary stories to say why these kinds of modules should have occurred, because they would have allegedly helped survival in the environment of evolutionary adaptation. More recently, another set of writers, Gazzaniga, Haidt, and Joseph, suggest one can explain morality in terms of 5 evolutionary determined modules. They claim that there exists a reciprocity module, a suffering module, a hierarchy module, an in-group, out-group coalition module, and a purity module. But again, there's no biological evidence such evolutionary determined ethical modules or systems actually exist. And again, the evidence that they use is about behavior. Interestingly, Haidt and Joseph don't mention a revenge module or a bullying module or a thieving corruption module, or any other ethically negative modules, even though there's just as much evidence for their existence as the positive ones which they mention. In fact, one could claim there is more evidence for these than the other ones. Now, developmental processes determine what is innate and what is not, for they determine the details of neuronal wiring. And these play out differently in different areas in the central nervous system, and this is what I want to talk about. Specifically, what occurs in the neocortex is quite different than what occurs in most precortical areas of the brain. And you need to take the real evolutionary causal chain into account. There's a biological need in a given context determines function or behavior which would be better for survival, and through adaptive development that desired function then shapes the physical structure which will lead to that function, which will lead to a better survival prospects. And so it's the need that drives it. So there's a function which will meet that need, and then there's a structure which will give the function behavior which will meet the need. And in looking at this, you need to take into account evolutionary origin, behavior or function, structure or physiology, and adaptive development or neural plasticity. Now, there's a tendency in all of this literature to refer to a very famous quote, which says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Now, that quote is correct, but it's also true. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of behavior or function. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of structure or function, and nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of adaptive development, or in the case of the brain, neuroplasticity. And the focus in all of this literature has been on the first of these 4 and not the others. That's what has been going wrong in this discussion from my viewpoint. So here's the central nervous system. It's a hierarchical structure: molecules, synapses, neurons, networks, maps, systems, and the central nervous system as a whole. At the bottom level, you've got those synapses, the networks, and so on. And it reaches to every part of the body. And this is a more detailed description of it. The nervous system components that need to be explained are all of these systems. You've got to explain in some sense all of these things: the autonomic nervous system, the somatic nervous system, the spinal cord, the cerebrum, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, the cerebellum, and so on. All of this has to be explained in some sense in terms of evolutionary needs. And what I'm claiming is that the explanation is somewhat different in the cortex, the neocortex, than it is in the other parts. Now, at the bottom level, what you've got are neurons with dendrites and the nucleus, and then the axons, and then those are joined across synaptic clefts to the following neurons, and so you at the bottom level you've got that they make up networks, and the networks in a rather abstract way have got an input layer, some hidden layers, and an output layer, and in those neural networks, and the brain is made up out of neural networks, the functionality comes from the connectivity. In that drawing there, every member of the input layer is connected to every neuron in the hidden layer, and so on. But in fact, in the real system, there would be many which were not connected to each other. And then in addition to the connectivity, there are the weights. And what you do is you train a neural network by showing it patterns you want it to recognize or something like that, and that's adjust the weights in those links in the neural network. And then what happens is you're given a specific input, like you give it a letter A to recognize, and the output layer comes with a recognition of the letter A. So you can use neural networks for pattern recognition. They can then generalize, and they can then predict. And the network is defined by its connectivity firstly, and the connection weights on the second hand. And the cortex structure has layered columns. Now it doesn't this is kind of what the cortex looks like. It's got vertical columns, and in each of these there are different horizontal layers, 7 layers in fact, which have got somewhat different structure in those different layers. And our individual knowledge and personalities are embodied in the details of these connections and their weights. Now, there are 10 to the 11th cortical neurons. There's up to 1,000 connections between them, so there's about 10 to the 14th synaptic connections whose weights determine who each of us is and what we know and what our memories are. Now, cortical modules, there's a huge amount of work being done, and much, much more is being done every day here through brain imaging studies of the different regions, what the different regions do, the motor cortex, the premotor cortex, the visual area, and so on, speech areas, and so on. And so some physical domains in the cortex, the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, the motor cortex, and so on, correspond to effective operational modules in the brain. But rewiring of external connections to these domains can result in a change of their function. And you can't do it to human beings, but a very famous experiment was done to ferrets when the auditory incoming connection was switched with the visual one. So this ferret there, he'd got a visual domain in the brain and an auditory domain, and some experimenters switched them. So now the visual stuff was going to the auditory cortex and vice versa. And this poor chap was pretty confused for a while, but he then learnt to live with that. In fact, they switched and they adapted, and his brain learnt to do it around. And so although there's a normal structure which normally develops, the brain is very, very plastic, and it can switch which domains do what job. Now, so that's the cortical structure, and the cortical structure, there are these columns there which have got that structure which we were just looking at there. Very important is the kind of sensory systems, and a typical one is the optic one, where you've got the retina there, the connections come down, and then they go into the visual cortex. And at the retina level, you've got these very detailed structures here, the pigmented layer of the retina, the rods, the cones, the bipolar centers, and then the ganglion cells, and then that goes off and goes down and into the cortex. So this is the kind of the sensory systems. And what is very important, will play a key role in what I'm talking about here, is what are called the ascending systems. You've got nuclei in the brain from which connections go out and up, and they spread neurotransmitters diffusely through the cortex, and in inter alia norepinephrine and dopamine and serotonin. And I'm sure that you've heard about how important these molecules are in the way the brain functions. And these systems, they're wired very specifically at the bottom end, but unlike other synaptic connections, the other connections join specific neurons to other specific neurons. These are diffuse at the top end. They don't join to specific neurons. They spread neurotransmitters through a brain domain. Now, the basic principles one, genetically determined brain functions. We have 24,000 genes, roughly, but 100,000 million neurons with up to 1,000 connections each. It isn't remotely possible for genes to wire the brain in detail. There isn't a fraction of the information needed to do so. Okay? What happens, in fact, is genetic information determines the basic brain areas. It has to determine the motor and sensory systems, the instinctive and primarily emotional reactions. The higher areas, the cortical areas, develop in response to interaction with the environment, guided by the emotional systems. And that's what I'm going to be talking about here. So the cortical structure, these layered columns cannot have been hardwired. There cannot be information in the DNA and RNA which gives you the specific details of all of that connections cannot possibly be there. Firstly, there's not enough genetic information to specify the detailed wiring. Yes, there is epigenetic processes, and in a sense those epigenetic processes are the learning processes I will be talking about. I claim you couldn't in any case write the necessary information into the DNA. Remember, anything you think or do does not alter the DNA you pass on to your children. So for instance, supposing, according to the Chomsky thing, you're practicing with language and you find some kind of language is better for conveying ideas to other people around you, that information can't get written into your gene. That's a fundamental principle of molecular biology. It couldn't be read out by developmental processes, because in order to do that, you would have to tell each neuron specifically which other neuron to connect with. You'd have to have an addressing system. That addressing system would have to be labeled in the DNA. It's not even conceivable that this kind of detailed connectivity could be done through developmental process. In fact, it's actually very difficult seeing how the ones that do work. The optic nerve has to be connected in that very precise pattern we saw through to the retina. It's actually quite difficult in developmental terms to see how that can happen. To see how this can happen is just inconceivable. And in any case, supposing you were given such a series of connections at the beginning of your life, it gets overwritten by brain plasticity and it doesn't stay the same, because your experiences change the wiring in any case. In fact, cortical wiring is developed adaptively, and this is from Lewis Wolpert's book on developmental biology. Neurons make precise connection with their target, so the neurons green in their target cells usually develop in different locations. Connections between them are established by axonal outgrowth, guided by the movement of axon tip, the growth cone. The initial set of relatively non-specific synaptic connections are then refined to produce a precise pattern of connectivity. And so what happens is the initial set of connections in that cortical area are made in a random way, and then they are refined. The kind of refinement takes place in all processes involving neuronal plasticity. This is adaptively guided by experience and learning. And experience and learning alters gene expression in the axons, which Eric Kandel made clear in his famous work on memory. And so this is what I'm going to call softwiring. Softwiring is when you set up a random set of connections and then you refine them to give the thing which will actually work for you. And so it's quite clear from this mechanism that you aren't writing into the cortex the kind of detailed information that you would need in order to specify a grammar or folk physics or anything else. What you're doing is you're wiring the cortex up in such a way that it's ready to learn, and then it learns by this process of synaptic refinement. So you delete some connections, and in fact this is synaptic pruning. This is the number of connections as a function of age there, and at the age of 10 months, you've got a huge number of synaptic connections, and then they drop off very heavily. And so at birth, you've got quite few. You've got many more at 6 years old, and then you've got much less at 14 years old. And at the age of 70, you've got very much less. Okay. And how does this refinement take place? The mechanisms are fairly well understood. It's done by biological processes like chromatin alterations mediate behavioral change. Chromatin remodeling takes place, results in dendritic pruning, and that gives you circuit refining as a result of behavioral training. And this has been shown to be very detailed way in the mouse, and this is from Science of 15th of July this year, showing how this process takes place. The mechanism mechanisms are reasonably well understood or are beginning to be understood. So brain plasticity underlies change all the time based on adaptive selection at both macro and micro levels. Neuronal connections are continually adjusted in response to the environment, enabling learning. Bottom-up action by genes and neurons underlies higher-level activities, but top-down causation from the social and ecological environment guides this activity. For instance, we each have learnt to speak English. That is a top-down influence from the social environment in which you live into the details of the synaptic connections. You're not born with connections wired up to speak English. You learn that from the social environment in which you live. So the brain adapts to this environment, and the physical mechanism that allows this to happen has been called neural Darwinism by Gerald Edelman. Now, people haven't liked that term, neural Darwinism. He changed it later on to neuronal group selection, but it's, I think, a very important mechanism, which I will talk about in a minute. So my take-home message 1 is there are no genetically determined cognitive modules in the neocortex whatever. It isn't possible for the kinds of reasons I said, but particularly for developmental reasons. There's no possibility of doing the detailed wiring in the neocortex that would be required for any of those modules which those theorists have claimed would exist. So there couldn't be a grammatical language module, Chomsky and Pinker, or a folk physics module, as Gehry has claimed. There aren't the genes needed. It couldn't possibly encode it in the genes or epigenetically. It's in competition with all the other many issues of affecting survival. And that's another point, is that in this environment, when you're trying to survive, you've got to fight off tigers, and you've got to find food, and you've got to find shelter and all the rest of it. And the details of language are going to have a pretty hard time competing with all of those things in order to help you to survive. It couldn't plausibly be wired if there was the required information, and that's the most important point which I think one needs to take home. What then are the real innate modules? So there are no hardwired cognitive system in the cortex. There are, however, softwired, developmentally shaped cognitive modules in the cortex arising from the interaction of individuals with their social, physical, and ecological environment, and I've just indicated briefly how that happens. So what leads to the effective folk modules? And the answer is brain plasticity guided by the primary emotional systems. So, what you have, the chain is the genotype. Oh, sorry, I'm going to skip that one. I've already talked about that. What happens is that there are top-down processes there. As you learn, the organism, at the higher level, the needs of the organism triggers cell signaling. The organs alter the way that genes are read. The proteins and RNA networks, they have got a protein machinery that selects, reads, and corrects genes. There are various processes acting down to the genetic level. These are the epigenetic processes which change how those connections work. So the counter proposal is that the real evolutionarily determined modules and systems are the sensory systems on the one hand, and the emotional system written about extensively by Jaak Panksepp in his book Affective Neuroscience, modified in one or two ways which I'll explain. These can lead to effective behavior similar to what would result if there were the alleged ethical and other modules. So in this system, what has to be hardwired, this stuff must be hardwired. You must have that pattern in the cortex, or else you won't, in the up here in the eye, or you won't be able to see. And so you've got to have this pattern of wiring very, very precisely set up, and developmental processes can do that. You've got to make the link through here and the link through down here, but it's at this end that the system is softwired. So the claim is, what the claim I'm making, at this end it's hardwired, very precise patterns are laid down, but at this end it is softwired. So there's a hardwired, very specific pattern of connection is laid down by developmental processes. At the visual end, except for the link to the cortex, which is softwired, the connections are not made to specific predetermined cortical neurons, and that's why you have to learn to see. When you're born, you don't know how to see, you learn to see, and the reason you have to learn to see is because at this end, you've got to train those neurons into seeing. Now, the basic principle that I'm now going to come to is emotional effectiveness. Emotions have a strong influence on how we act. Indeed, we cannot function intellectually if the emotional centers are damaged, and Antonio Damasio has written extensively about that in his writing. Emotional tags play a key role in how we react to events and peoples and places. And emotions change neural connections and are embodied in memory, because emotions are actually what drive us in the way that we act in an everyday like this. And more than that, they guide neural development. Now, this is from Edelman and Tononi's book about neuronal group selection. And what you've got is you've got these systems here. This is the norepinephrine system, and what he says is the following: you've got your local systems, the columns up there, which I've been talking about before. These are the soft-wired systems. And so those columns are locally there in the cortex. You've got your non-local systems, these systems which spread neurotransmitters to the brain, and they're non-local systems. And the source is what is called the limbic system. This comes from the locus coeruleus, and it spreads these diffusely throughout there. And this spreads these neurotransmitters around. And what happens is the following. When you are thinking about something or doing something, certain neurons are active and other ones are not active at that time. The emotional systems here send neurotransmitters through there, and what they do is they interact with any of the neurons which are active at that moment and either strengthen or weaken it depending on what the case is. And what that does is it reinforces a pattern of activation. It's an incredibly powerful mechanism, because whatever the pattern of activation in the brain is at that moment, these neurotransmitters then weaken or strengthen that pattern of activation. And Edelman calls this a value system guiding neuronal development, because the neurotransmitters are basically conveying to the cortex. They are shaping the plasticity of the cortex, and therefore they are what Edelman calls a value system guiding neuronal development. Now, the way to think about this is that you've got an instinctual brain, the reptilian brain, you've got an emotional brain, the old mammalian brain, and you've got the intellectual system, the neo-mammalian brain. And this is what's been called the triune brain. And if you ask, where does Edelman's value system originate from? And the answer is, it originates in the limbic system or affective system, which here is the old mammalian system. And so the three key books here are Descartes' Error by Damasio, explaining how emotions are what immediately guides what happens in the intellect, Affective Neuroscience by Peng, in which he has studied these primary emotional systems in depth in animals and human beings and showed the analogy between them. And he's got 7 primary emotional systems, which I talk about in a minute, and a very interesting book called Evolutionary Psychiatry by Stevens and Price, which I will also mention again in a minute. So this now comes from Peng, and he's talking now from his viewpoint about his primary emotional systems. And what he's talking about is exactly the same systems. He's talking about the visceral emotional systems and how they spread through neurotransmitters into the rest of the brain. And this is, if you look at that, it's exactly the same system that Edelman was talking about there. So biological evolution can't shape specific cultural responses or behavioral models. It shapes broad brain abilities. So the biological evolution sets up the brain for this to work, but not any of the details. The biology sets up the broad brain abilities that enable responses in the modules, particularly general pattern recognition and prediction mechanisms based in memory, and 7 or 9 basically determined primary emotional systems, which I will talk about now, that shape how we react to our environment. And it's these primary emotional systems which spread these neurotransmitters that influence our immediate reactions, shape neural connections, affecting future reactions. So what you can do is a contrast here. Hebbian processes, fire together, wire together, it strengthens whatever is happening at the moment, but there's no value there. So if something bad is happening or something good is there, it doesn't matter. The Hebbian system reinforces whatever is going on at that moment. Skinnerian conditioning, a conditioning system, it's got adaptive refinement, but it's got a response to the overall state. Skinnerian conditioning tells the brain whether it's a good or a bad outcome. So it's got more information than the Hebbian processing. Effective neural Darwinism, which is what I'm talking about now, where you've got these 7 or 9 primary emotional systems feeding information in. It's activity dependent neural refinement. Its response to the overall affective state, but it's got further geometric dimensions. In fact, it's got 9 dimensions which convey information about the kinds of things which used to help survival in the evolutionary past and which still help survival even in the modern situation today. Eric Kandel talks about brain plasticity in the following way. All mental processes derive from operations of the brain. Genes determine neuronal functioning because they determine the protons which are then going to float around in the synapses. And social and developmental factors, according to Kandel, contribute importantly to the variance in mental illness. Social and developmental factors, therefore, express themselves in altered gene expression, and I've added in via emotions and associated neurotransmitters. And then Kandel says nurture is ultimately expressed in nature. Because of this, the social and developmental factors change the way that gene expression takes place in the brain. He continues, altered gene expression induced by learning, and I've added in associated with emotions, give rise to changed patterns of neuronal connections, which give rise to different forms of thinking and behavior. Psychotherapy produces changes in long-term behavior by learning, which produce changes in gene expression via neurotransmitters associated with emotions. I've added that in, and hence changes in neuronal interconnections. And what this does, this expresses top-down action from the brain to neuronal connections. What Kandel does, Kandel is a Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist who's written one of the major textbooks in neuroscience. And he's giving you the mechanism whereby neuropsychotherapy changes neuronal connections, therefore can change the way that your brain operates. And so, putting this together, what I'm saying is, as well as being hardwired, the sensory systems, this system must be hardwired. You have to have the system. It's hardwired in the following sense. It comes from very specific nuclei in the brain at the bottom there. It is diffuse at the top. It doesn't have to make specific connections at the top. It doesn't need specific addresses at the top. It just has to go generically to a cortical area so that these neurotransmitters spread through the brain there and affect the connections in the brain there in a long-term way. So the take-home message from this is the real evolutionarily determined modules and systems are the sensory systems, links to the senses, and the primary emotional systems, written about extensively by Peng in his book Affective Neuroscience. The latter are omitted in almost all evolutionary psychology discussions, and that's a key omission when considering developmental behavior and culture. Now, what's the nature of these modules, the primary emotional modules? The real evolutionarily determined modules affecting behavior are the 7 basic emotional systems wrten about by Peng, modified in 2 ways, addition of a ranking system and a discuss system, and the play and panic system generalized a bit. So the emotional drives underlie both behavior and brain development are driven by 9 basic systems, and there are 3 particularly I want to point out to you. One of the basic systems is the drive for meaning, the drive for the need to understand, which George Kelly wrote about in A Theory of Personality and Jeff Hawkins in his book on intelligence. And this is what Peng calls the seeking system. And so we have a deep-seated need to search and to seek and to understand. And that's one of our primary things which enables animals of all types to explore and to search and to learn from that exploration. The second one is the need for affiliation, belonging, starting with the mother-child bond and then extending to our peers. And so we have a deep-seated emotional need to belong to a group, starting, as I said, with the mother-child bond and then to others. And then the competitive drive, which one might call the ranking system, are associated with territory in the broadest sense. And you can see this in many, many animal species, the pecking order in chickens, the alpha male in dogs and lions and all the rest of it. And the ranking system is one of the primary emotional systems which plays a key role in emotional life of all the higher animals. In fact, it goes way back down to chickens even, and human beings. So here's a table. It's clearly crucial to clarify which are secondary and which are primary emotions. Damasio suggests the primary emotions are happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. But for instance, surprise, in my view, is not an emotional system, and I don't think Damasio's got it right. He characterizes development, emergent, secondary emotions as embarrassment, shame, guilt, contempt and indignation, sympathy, compassion, awe, wonder, elevation, gratitude, pride, jealousy, and envy. And so that's one, and there are many, many others in the literature, many classifications of primary and secondary emotions. I'm going to throw in my lot with Panksepp, and this is Panksepp's proposal as revised by myself and my colleague Judith Taronchik. There are individual needs and group needs, and the individual needs for the basic function is the basic pleasure-distress system, liking, fulfillment, and satiation. Satisfying needs, and it leads to learning and identification of needs. And the seeking or wanting system, which is arousal, excitement, and seeking, engagement, searching, and underlies the search for meaning. And so what in fact happens is the seeking system looks for something, and then when you have found it, the pleasure or distress system gives you the satisfaction you found it and turns off the seeking system. These are separate systems. And addiction happens when the satisfaction, when the seeking system finds what it was looking for, and then it doesn't turn off the pleasure distress system. And so addiction arises when these two systems aren't working properly together like they ought to do. Basic survival, there's a disgust system, repulsion, physical safety, avoiding harmful foods and environments. And there's an important difference. What the disgust system do, it's basically very, very old, very, very simple organisms move away from poisonous things and towards food sources. And the disgust system, it's an anticipatory system. When you burn your hands on a fire, the pain system tells you your hand is being damaged and pull it away. Now that's too late, you've already damaged your hand. The disgust system is telling you if you eat that food, it will make you sick. So it's an anticipatory thing. It's telling you not to do it because it'll be bad for you in the future. And that's the nature of these systems. They are guiding you as to future actions. And this is a new one which my colleague Judith and I added into Panksepp because Panksepp didn't have that one in. He did have the rage and the fear system. These are the fight and the flight systems. And then a very important basic system is learning, the play system. And play is crucial to the functioning of all higher animals. It's crucial to dogs and cats and birds and ourselves. The play system is what leads to problem rehearsal, creativity, aesthetics, and all animals, dogs, cats, birds, and so on, play. The playing is the basic thing which helps them to learn because they practice things while they are playing. Panksepp talks about rough and tumble play, which you see in all the animals, but in fact with humans you've got the added thing of imaginative play, and imaginative play is what opens up to you the whole world of creativity. Okay, then there are these social needs, and there's the love system, sexual desire, satiation, ensuring procreation. Now, very important are two systems for group cohesion, social bonding. There's the need and attachment system, which creates bonding through the need for others, and the care and nurturing system, which responds to it. So there's the need to belong, and there's the nurturing system, which responds to that need. And this again is crucial for survival because our infants are born so helpless they wouldn't survive if they weren't looked after by the system. And so the way nature deals with that is to give a strong emotional need to look after those children, and then the child gets a strong need to belong. And this need attachment system, though, however, then generalizes as you grow. You have a great need to belong to a group. And if you get excluded from a group, then you suffer emotional trauma. I'll mention that in just a minute. And then finally, you have the group functioning of regulating conflict, the ranking system, which I've already mentioned, dominance and submission, controlling aggression in society. And it deals with territory in a very broad sense, owning or possessing things, and in a certain sense, it's the basis of self-identity, because it's not to do just with physical territory, it's to do with abstract territory like ideas and things. And the academic world is full of people who are fighting the ranking system, claiming their dominance over others in terms of academic ideas and so on. And the point about this is that a crucial part in the evolution of humanity was the formation of groups. And the bonding system makes the groups form, and you are much more likely to survive if you're in a group than if you're on the own. But once you've got the group, you then start getting conflict between people fighting for resources, and what nature has come up as a way of dealing with this is the ranking system. So you fight every now and then for your place in the rank, and once you've got your place in the rank, everybody settles down and accepts that they get whatever goods are due to them in terms of their place in that ranking system. And that's how you set up relatively stable groups. You have a great need, psychological need to belong to the group, but then you regulate the conflict through the ranking system. So this are, in that, Ardrey has written his book, The Territorial Imperative, talking about the ranking system. And this book by Stevens and Price, which I mentioned, says they are psychiatrists. They said in the history, in their psychological practices, they found two primordial systems whose malfunction leads to most of the psychiatric problems they come across. And the one was the affiliation or belonging system, people who feel excluded from some group or other. That leads to psychiatric illness. And the other is the ranking system, that you don't feel in some sense that you are recognized for what you're doing and so on. And then that leads to a great, again, psychological trauma. And if you just look at the world around this, you will find that the ranking system is crucial in the military, in sport, in social systems, and in the academic system. So the primary emotional systems have developed to give advanced guidance to the brain as how to behave in ways likely to significantly enhance survival prospects. It's for this reason that they are hardwired. It has a multidimensional nature. I've shown you that multidimensional nature that channels individual behavior in adaptive ways and encourages group formation, underlying the development of the social brain. And many people have thought that one of the key things in the way that humans have developed further than the primates is because of the social brain and the need that gives then to communicate with others, and therefore the desire to develop language. Okay, what about the standard arguments for the modules? How does my argument stand in relation to them? Okay, the standard arguments are based on behavioral patterns, not taking physiology or development into account. And I've given you what I regard as a very strong argument for saying there simply cannot be any innate modules whatever in the cortex, but there are innate modules in the precortical areas. The standard arguments do not actually establish that a physical module exists. They talk about behavior, and behavior can occur when there isn't any physical module at all. What happens is separate regions in the brain form temporary coalitions to produce various kinds of behavior, but there isn't any specific physical area in many cases. And insofar as the standard arguments show by brain imaging that there are specific areas, for instance, associated with language, they do not establish if they are innate or rather developmental outcomes. What about the poverty of stimulus argument? It simply isn't true if one takes into account the intense mother-child emotional interaction. And there's a wonderful book on this, Greenspank and Shanker, called The First Idea, that talks in depth how the mother-child emotional bond is based in this primary emotional system, and how that leads. It's called The First Idea, how that leads to the development of language, the interaction of the mother and child, the mother talking all the child, communicating, the child desperately wanting to communicate back with the mother, and that social bond being totally overrules the poverty of stimulus argument. What about language universals? Well, Terence Deacon has a very, very good argument about this, that these language universals, which are one of Chomsky's big things there, are not due to the fact that they were inborn through some genetic thing, but because they are due to semiotic constraints in describing universal experiences. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And what about the frame problem, which is the fact that you have to know what direction to act. The analogy I like to give for this is in a computer system, you've got your software, your programs there, but you've got an operating system which decides which program will work next on the basis of an order of priorities. And that's what the primary emotions do. They tell the intellect, pay attention to this thing next. This is where you must use your intellectual capacities next. So the primary emotional systems are telling the brain what to pay attention to next. So in terms of language universals, Terence Deacon has plausibly argued that any language system, whatever, must obey necessary semiotic constraints on universal grammar in order that the language can be an adequate reflection of the world around us. And so, in fact, this is a possibility space for those who were at my talk yesterday. There's a possibility space for languages. The language must represent reality in some adequate way. That's a semiotic constraint, and that puts constraints on possible grammar. These are discovered by human beings rather than being created, because they are based in the underlying logic of what is possible in symbolic representation of the real world. So Deacon says semiotic constraints delimit the outside limits of the space of possibilities in which language has evolved within our species, because they are the outside limits of any symbolic form of communication, whatever. And that's in a book called Language Evolution, edited Christensen and Kirby. And then there's a current set of survey articles which have just come out in Frontiers in Psychology, edited by Umberto Ansaldo and Enfield in the June 2016, Volume 7, and this editorial links to 9 Frontiers articles considering the universal grammar hypothesis from different viewpoints, and concludes that nativist viewpoints re grammar and phonology suffer from significant shortcomings, and a viable alternative is an emergent grammar hypothesis. So my take-home message is the standard arguments do not take physiology or developmental possibilities into account, nor do they take into account the emotional drives that powerfully underlie learning. The developmental argument characterizes what is possible in terms of cortical development. General purpose pattern recognition and prediction abilities are fine. Detailed cognitive information isn't possible. This fact trumps the usual arguments put forward for cortical modules. I think I will leave it at that point. The take-home message is brain plasticity underlies change all the time based on adaptive selection at both macro and micro levels. Neuronal connections are continually adjusted in response to the environment. Bottom-up action by genes and neurons underlies higher-level activities. Top-down causation guides this lower-level activity, and effective cortical modules such as language arise developmentally. They're not hardwired in. Attempts to link behavior biology and evolution should take these biological issues into account because they shape what happens. So the summary is many claims of the existence of innate modules by linguists on the one hand and evolutionary psychologists on the other are made without taking adequate account of the nature of genetic and developmental processes or brain physiology. These biological constraints give very clear guidance to what is and what is not actually biologically innate in the brain. There can be no innate cortical modules with specific cognitive content, but there are innate sensory systems on the one hand and innate affective systems on the other. It is the latter that guide developmental processes in the cortex and so lead to the existence of effective cognitive modules insofar as these do indeed exist.